President, we have a national emergency.
This is one of the things that we can shoot first and ask questions later. Normally you can't do that.
All of a sudden these trees started moving out of the way. They parted for me. And then I came out into this opening, and there where I saw Jesus Christ.
Back in 1927, an American socialist, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said the American people would never vote for socialism. But he said under the name of liberalism, the American people will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. He is more imminent.
James Madison, in 1788, speaking to the Virginia Convention, said, "Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations."
When men were free.
Broadcasting live from a secret location buried deep below the earth, you're about to make a connection to the signs of the times. W. Dean Shook is live on the air right now.
Welcome into End Time News. I am your humbled host, W. Dean Shook. Thank you for being here. Let me say welcome to our international audience, everyone on the iHeartRadio Network, the Spreaker Radio Network, and of course on the Blog Talk Radio Network. And welcome to all of our regular broadcast affiliates. I appreciate everybody so much, and I really am humbled, proud, and privileged to be able to bring you the news that the mainstream is just not going to touch. We're going to have an interesting discussion today. But before we start it, let me remind everyone, you can download the End Time News mobile app for your iPhone or your Android at Google Play or at the App Store. It's absolutely free, and you can never miss another episode of End Time News. So we're going to talk about ISIS today. Now, I put the title of the show of Know Thy Enemy because they really are our enemy. And there's a big question whether ISIS is going to strike on American soil or not. You know, all Muslims believe that the United States is the great Satan, that Israel is the little Satan. We are their target. We are their main goal. And it's important for us to understand who these people are. We're going to go through a little bit of the history of how ISIS got started, and we're going to go through the ideology and what are the chances of them actually hitting us on U.S. soil. Is ISIS a threat to America? Most Americans feel that all of the ISIS activity is distant, faraway place, has nothing to do with the average American, has nothing to do with your going to the store, filling up the car with gas, maybe taking the kids to school. Well, what if you're wrong? Now, before we look at a bit of the history of how ISIS came to be and who was or was not involved, who has to take some responsibility, I want to share this report from WND. This was about Pamela Geller. In an exclusive statement to WND, Pamela Geller has a message for Americans about the latest threat against her by the terror group ISIS. She says, ISIS is here, the war is here. They aren't just coming after me, they're coming after anyone who does not submit. Despite the changes to her daily life because of pending threats and attempts on her life, Geller says she's taking comfort in the determination and grit of everyday Americans who join her in this fight. She said she stands with and for the millions of Americans like herself who will not relinquish our inalienable rights to devout savages. As I think everyone knows, Geller's home address was tweeted out this week by an ISIS account believed to be linked to the Islamic State jihadist kingpin in Britain. The tweet that drew so much attention said, #GoForth. It then reveals Geller's New York City address very specifically, including her apartment number. The threat came on the heels of the arrest of a third man linked to the plot to behead Geller. Well, you remember her Dra Muhammad event in Garland, Texas? Elton Simpson and Nadir Sufi of Phoenix responded to a call to avenge the prophet. They traveled to Garland, where they were shot and killed by a security guard after opening fire in an apparent attempt to get into the building. Islamic radicals have since called for Geller's head. They vow to kill anyone who blasphemes Muhammad. Geller is concerned Americans don't understand the scope of this ISIS plot. She told WND, "The left, the rhinos, the Islamic apologists say I'm provocative for standing against Sharia. Were the Jewish children that were murdered in cold blood by a devout Muslim at a Jewish school in France provocative? Was Daniel Pearl provocative? Were James Foley, Steve Sotloff, or Alan Henning provocative? Were the shoppers at the kosher deli in Hyper Kashir provocative? Are the Yazidis and non-Muslim girls raped and sold into slavery being provocative? Is the existence of Israel provocative? Are the millions of non-Muslims being ethnically cleansed across the Middle East provocative? Were the trade towers provocative? Were the soldiers at Fort Hood provocative? Was beheading victim Colleen Hufford in Oklahoma provocative? According to Seacoast Online, Jerry Delamus, a resident of Rochester, New Hampshire, is planning to hold another Draw Muhammad contest later this year, despite the terror attacks during Keller's Texas event. He told International Business Daily, "I'm not worried about taking a risk. It's more important to defend our way of life in this country, our constitutional rights for everybody." Well, and I also want to share something else. And we need to take heed of some tactics that ISIS has tried to use in Gaza, because they are related to what they could do here. Israel faced a stunning new challenge from its age-old Islamic enemies in last summer's Gaza war, one that, if successful, would have led to unspeakable human carnage. Captain Dan Gordon, veteran of 6 wars and member of the Israeli Defense Forces Advanced Sniper Team, says Hamas's attack strategy in July of 24 went beyond the standard rocket barrage of Israeli cities, a brazen plan to send hundreds of heavily armed terrorists through tunnels in Gaza up to Israel's population centers, and it almost succeeded. The war in Gaza brought in something that was really the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen in my life, he said, and that is a terrorist attacked tunnels that went underneath the recognized 1948 borders of Israel from Gaza. And all of a sudden, it was like Night of the Living Dead. He said in a recent Fox interview, "Your lawn opened up, and like zombies coming out of the ground, a dozen terrorists, armed with RPGs, machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, tranquilizer shots, and handcuffs, meant to take women and children hostage, kill and maim as many as possible, and then drag others back to Gaza as hostages." Well, Gordon told WND the Middle East often serves as research and development lab. What starts there often spreads to the rest of the world. And sure enough, a little online research will turn up articles about the tunnel warfare strategy now being developed by ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Also by the Taliban in Afghanistan and other Islamist groups in North Africa. But the most vulnerable country to tunnel attacks is not Israel, Gordon says. It's the United States. ISIS operatives are likely already inside America, but nobody knows how many, where, or in what capacity. Did they come in from tunnels? He said, "I doubt it, because they don't need to. Our border is so porous, they could easily come across the southern border, as thousands of people do every day," Gordon said. And they could have Western passports from countries which require no visas. He said, "My guess is there are ISIS fighters in the country doing advanced scouting, studying all of the preliminary things a professional terror attack takes into account. Because professional terrorist attacks takes months to set up." He said, "You surveil the target. You look for ingress and egress routes. You study response times. You look at what you plan to do after the first attack." He said, "Do you set off a bomb and then detonate a second after the responders arrive? Or do you launch a second attack simultaneously on another side of town?" So my guess is there's advanced scouting planning as we speak. But when it comes time to launch the big attack, that's when the tunnels come into play. ISIS' job will be made easier by the fact that an established drug smuggling tunnel system into the U.S. from Mexico already exists. The FBI says it has active ISIS investigations in all 50 states, even Alaska, presumably looking into Americans and immigrants who might carry out lone wolf attacks based on cell phone conversations and social media chatter. But Gordon doesn't believe ISIS will be satisfied with lone wolf attacks on the U.S. He believes they're planning something much bigger, something more befitting for their image as the largest, wealthiest, most brutal terror organization on the planet. Gordon believes the U.S. is far more vulnerable than Israel to a tunnel attack. He said, I guarantee ISIS had a presence in Gaza during last summer's war, and I guarantee they studied very, very carefully Hamas's use of terror tunnels. They studied why they failed, how they might have succeeded, and they've applied all of those lessons to the U.S., he said. Because in the U.S., they have two things going for them to make it easier to pull it off. And number one, they don't have to dig any tunnels. The tunnels are already here. And we know that various Islamic terror organizations have established relationships with the Mexican cartels. Hezbollah, for one. We know they're there. He said, we don't think for a minute that because they're Shiite, they won't cooperate with the Sunni ISIS. The problems that present at a security level are difficult to overstate, he said. If you look at the U.S. monitoring of the border, it's sporadic at best. We don't have aerial arsenals. We don't have aerial assets. We don't have American military deployed on the border, Gordon said. So you have 500 to 1,000 fighters who could easily come up out of a tunnel and get into a truck. And understand, people are used to seeing trucks going in and out of these areas. There's nothing uncommon about it, because the smugglers are smuggling large amounts of drugs, and they want people to be used to seeing trucks going in and out. They could just as easily smuggle ISIS fighters. We have to understand, ISIS is here. Our president is bringing in unchecked, unvetted Muslims from around the world in record numbers. Even the federal government says they can't check them all. We, the people, need to understand ISIS and this Muslim jihad. And we're going to start that understanding right now. I want to start this with a clarification. Is it ISIS or ISIL? You know, most of the international media, and even our president, is not sure which one of these to use. Until recently, it was referred to as the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, hence the acronym ISIL. The correct acronym is ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The Levant is an old term that refers to a country of the Eastern Mediterranean. Some scholars include it in Cyprus and a small part of Turkey, but basically, the Levant has throughout history meant Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. This means Jordan, the West Bank, and Israel itself are part of the Levant. It's a geographical area of Arab states. The Levant is not a terrorist group or an organization. It's not a made-up word. And to attribute these areas of Palestine and Jordan and the West Bank and Israel is giving credit to ISIS that they don't deserve. They don't control these areas. So when you hear our president refer to them as ISIL, he's saying all of these Mediterranean countries are an Islamic state. And it speaks volumes about he or anyone else who calls them ISIL feels about ISIS. They're giving the entire area a label of an Islamic theocratic group of nations where the caliphate rules and Sharia is the law, which we know is not true. Jordan and the West Bank and Israel are not under their caliphate. Not yet, anyway. However, I've been waiting to see if ISIS has the intestinal fortitude to attack Israel, because if they thought that they could defeat Israel, they would have done it by now. Fact is, Israel would slap them down, because Israel is arguably one of the strongest powers in the Middle East. While other countries have large armies and some have nuclear weapons, it doesn't mean that they're well enough organized or trained to use them effectively or efficiently, where Israel is highly organized, very well trained, and knows exactly what they're doing. Because believe me, if ISIS thought they had a chance against Israel, they would have attacked by now. And I want to make something else clear here, and that's the attitude of these ISIS fighters. I have some quotes from some frontline ISIS fighters who say that their families are the least important thing in their life. They can't win the battle for Allah if they're sitting at home with their families. They're looking for hard times. They say the harder the fight is, the closer they are to Allah. You know, through the history of conflicts and war, It seems that the side with the greater cause seems to be the side that wins. When people have a true belief in what they're fighting for, they become a formidable enemy. So with American Christians, it would seem like, or even non-Christians, it would seem like we have the greater cause. And yet, Americans, and especially American Christians, don't seem to want to stand up and do anything about anything. And you know, I'm really puzzled about Sweeney, Texas. Now, why do Texans allow this Muslim enclave to take over one of their towns like that? Let me ask you, Texas, are you afraid of these girls with piercings all over their face who don't shave their legs? You know, the ones who believe that Islam is a race and they call you a racist or a bigot, even when they don't know what these words really mean? Are you that intimidated? The Texas I used to know would have ran them out on a rail. It's because we're told they have rights too? Is that it? Well, they don't have a right to plot to take over our country, and that's what they're doing. So it seems the only way I can get a response from anyone is to be blunt, to call you out. So that's what I'm doing, Texas. I'm calling you out. Everyone, every American man, pull up your panties, boys. It's time to stand up for God and country. It's time for Congress to stand up to our Muslim president and stop his jihad. He is, at the people's consent, tearing America down brick by brick. There's a lot of crying and a lot of whining, but no action. No one will do anything about it. Looks like our Muslim president has the greater cause. All right, I'll stop my tirade. Let's move on to the Middle East. Some of this research that I'm going to present in this program today is research that I've done. Some of it is from the Foreign Policy Institute. So what events in our past have allowed the formation of ISIS? Well, let's see what the Middle East looks like today. It is ungoverned territory, politically unstable, and endemic violence in Iraq and Syria that has really shaped the whole region that made the rise of ISIS possible. As Deputy Secretary of State William J. Burns said in September of 2014, within a number of states, we've seen the collapse of a half-century-old political order, society that for far too long have known too little freedom, far too little opportunity, and far too little dignity. And then it began to erupt. ISIS took advantage of all of these developments: state collapse, proliferation of weapons, regional rivalries, sectarian polarization, and they've used this to prosper and grow. You know, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011 enabled terrorist groups to develop and flourish in that country. Former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta wrote in his 2014 memoir, he said, "My fear, as I voiced to the president and others, was that if the country split apart and slid back into violence that we'd see in the years immediately following the U.S. invasion, it could become a new haven for terrorists to plot attacks against the U.S." And that's exactly what happened. The vacuum of authority triggered by the Syrian war in 2011 allowed the country to become a key base for Islamist extremists. In January 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry called Bashar al-Assad a one-man super magnet for terrorism. Well, Valerie Sibilia of the Institute of the Study of War wrote in 2013, she said, "The protracted conflict in Syria has made it an attractive battlefield for al-Qaeda, not only because of Syria's strategic location in the Arab world, but also because it's created the type of environment in which al-Qaeda operates most effectively. War has disrupted the very fabric of Syrian society in hard-hit areas, with the breakdown of existing governance structures, the displacement of vulnerable populations, and the increasing difficulty that people have in meeting their basic needs. And on top of that, Iran's destructive policy toward Iraq and Syria helped lay the groundwork for the territory's bloodshed. Tehran's aggressive posture in the Middle East, including its support for the Assad regime and Hezbollah, its fueling of sectarian tensions in Iraq, and its effort to co-opt Baghdad as a client state, made ISIS at first seem a little less important by comparison. But it gives it space to grow and flourish. Behind all of this, the hidden hand of why we're focusing on ISIS is Iran. U.S. Army veteran Richard Brennan, who's now with the RAND Corporation, said, We wouldn't have ISIS today if it hadn't been the degree to which Iran had tried to destabilize the region and tried to broaden the Sunni-Shiite war that's taken place. Because there's a link between al-Qaeda and the rise of ISIS. ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq. In October 2014, Congressional Research Service report explained that the Islamic State's ideology and organizational roots lie in the focus built and led by the late Abu Zarqawi in Iraq from 2002 through 2006. The Tawhid wa Jihad, that's monotheism with jihad, and al-Qaeda in the land of two rivers, that's al-Qaeda in Iraq. Following Zarqawi's death at the hands of U.S. forces in June of 2006, al-Qaeda leaders repackaged the group known as the Islamic State, ISI. In April 2013, it expanded its operation into Syria the year before the group renamed itself ISIS. Well, the rebellion of Sunni tribes against al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2006 to 8, also known as the Anbar Awakening, severely weakened the organization, but in 2011, withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq allowed it to regroup, as a September 2013 report by ISW's Jessica Lewis explained. She said by 2011, al-Qaeda in Iraq was still able to conduct attacks, but the organization was isolated, disrupted, and did not pose an existential threat to the state. However, in a new round of violence in 2012, fatalities rose above 500. By the first half of 2013, according to the National Counterterrorism Center, suicide bombers and car bombs caused about 1,000 Iraqi deaths, the highest monthly violent death toll since 2008. The onset of the Syrian civil war in 2011 spurred ISI to form an affiliate group called Jabhat el-Nusra that would try to replace the Assad regime with an Islamic State. Well, in December of 2012, the State Department formally designated el-Nusra as a foreign terrorist organization. Since November 2011, it said in a statement, el-Nusra Front has claimed nearly 600 attacks, ranging from more than 40 suicide attacks to small arms and improvised explosive devices operations in major city centers, including Damascus, Aleppo, Dara, Homs. And through these attacks, el-Nusra has tried to portray itself as part of the legitimate Syrian opposition, while it is, in fact, an attempt by al-Qaeda in Iraq to hijack the struggles of the Syrian people for its own purposes. So when our government says we need to arm these Syrian rebels are actually al-Qaeda in Iraq, renamed. That's why there's so many people complaining that we're arming terrorists, because we are. In early 2014, a power struggle between al-Nusra and ISIS over control of this anti-Assad movement led to a formal break between them. The break between them turned into open violence that's claimed as many as 3,000 lives. As the Washington Post reported, the split means that al-Qaeda no longer has representation in Iraq, where ISIS originated, and leaves el-Nusra, which is widely regarded among Syrians as a more moderate than the hardline ISIS, and the sole representative of al-Qaeda in Syria. Well, recently, ISIS and el-Nusra have reportedly reached a truce in order to focus their efforts against moderate rebels and the Assad regime. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper said in November of 2014 that this kind of cooperation remains limited to tactical accommodations on the battlefield. According to ISW's Jessica Caffarella, who says the two groups are eventually likely to cooperate in the operational and strategic level, and they share mutual goals in the short term. This may include joint action against the Assad regime and embolden el-Nusra to initiate offensive operations against the regime on battlefields that have stalled. So what is their ideology? What is the ideology behind these people? I'm going to take a short break here, but when I come back, we're going to look at this ideology and see what they feel their greater cause is. I'll be back right after this short message. You're listening to End Time News.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, zero. These are the stakes. We either stand up to supporters of terrorism, or we and our allies risk losing the freedom we cherish. We must not let the jihadist government of Iran get a nuclear bomb. President Obama has had opportunity to stop them, but he's failing. Join with us, and let's secure America now.
Hi folks, have you noticed the federal government and police departments are using drones for everything? Drones are expensive. They're hard to fly. It can take up to a week just to learn to make a drone hover. Not anymore. There's a new generation of drones that are not only affordable but very easy to fly. Now you can have your own personal drone, anything from a micro mini that'll fit in the palm of your hand, right up to a full-scale model, 10 inches in diameter like the model I have, the V949 Pro. Comes with a 6-axis 4-rotor blade and an HD 2.4 camera mounted on the bottom. These drones are made of a space-age polymer. They're durable. And don't worry about crashing your drone. Replacement blades for this drone from the website are only $1.80 for a pack of 4. That's right, I said $1.80 for a pack of 4 replacement blades. You can also get an extra long life battery. This battery allows you up to a half hour of flight time with a maximum speed of 40 miles an hour. Have your own personal drone, and you can get all of this for under $70. If you go to the website, wdeanshook.com, and click on the banner on the webpage, you can get from 7 to 22% off your personal drone. It's shipped as a kit. You can be up and flying your own personal drone with an HD camera within a half hour. Come to the webpage, wdeanshook.com. Click on that banner and get your discount today. wdeanshook.com.
GoDaddy offers everything you need to make a name for yourself on the web, from domain names and website builders to complete e-commerce solutions. We've earned our place as the world's #1 accredited domain registrar by delivering world-class products at competitive prices and support them with industry-best services delivered 24/7, 365. We're proud to serve our customers from locations around the world. Sign up now at wdeanshook.com and get your domain name as low as $5.99 a year. Sign up now at wdeanshook.com. Go, Daddy. Go, Daddy.
End Time Prophecy News is the only program on the air that runs on recycled chickweed ethanol, working to save the planet every day.
There is a sense in the world. There's a sense among believers. There's a sense among unbelievers. There's a sense among all peoples that things are unhinged. The Middle East is unhinged with uprisings, revolutions, and where's this heading?
How are followers of Jesus to relate to all of these things? How do they relate to biblical prophecy?
America is in spiritual, moral crisis. Values are changing, and so rapidly, that have not happened in the history of man.
How are level-headed, responsible Christians to relate to the testimony of the biblical prophets and the unfolding of chaos throughout the world?
Not just believers are wondering, is this a sign of the end?
أحلى نشيد This is a Fox News alert, and do not kid yourself. ISIS is here.
New concerns that ISIS may be plotting an attack on U.S. soil. A member of the terror group tweeting, "You ain't seen nothing yet."
The ABC 7i team tonight investigating a possible new terrorist threat to Illinois.
On Tuesday, a new threat originated in an online posting made from an apparent ISIS supporter. In it, the person claims ISIS has soldiers in various U.S. states. And, judging from the reaction of some U.S. media outlets, one might think the claim actually held some weight. But does ISIS actually need to be in the U.S. to be an issue? Claiming to have, quote, soldiers in the U.S. runs in the same propaganda vein as the group's high-minded claims it'll conquer everything from Rome to the U.S. Random internet posts or tweets from people claiming to be a part of ISIS are not the same as the group actually masterminding attacks in the U.S. like Al-Qaeda did in the case of the 9/11 attacks. Where ISIS does seem to have an advantage is in using social media to inspire lone wolf-style attacks. Take Sunday night's attack on a cartoon drawing contest of the Prophet Muhammad in Garland, Texas, for example.
For the first time, ISIS claims responsibility for an attack on American soil and warns more are to come.
ISIS's claim that the two Texas gunmen were actually soldiers of the group is certainly suspect at best. Speaking to Time, the head of the intelligence project at the Brookings Institution was doubtful of a direct connection, saying police would have been able to confirm one fairly easily using phone or computer records. But there's evidence at least one of the shooters, who had been previously investigated for jihadi activities, had interacted with a known ISIS fighter in the past on Twitter after he called for an attack in Dallas. It's something the Brookings Institution's J.M. Berger tells the New York Times is part of ISIS populist attraction, where they can retroactively ratify attacks that they like and ignore those that don't serve its purpose. In a February speech, FBI Director James Comey revealed the department was investigating extremists in various stages of radicalizing in all 50 states. Not all were necessarily aligned with ISIS, though he said they were a major player in inciting radicalization. So while ISIS may not physically be in the U.S., its ability to inspire pre-radicalized extremists to perform their own attacks is still something to be wary of. For Newsy, I'm Sebastián Martínez.
And thank you for allowing me that break. I appreciate it very much. We're going to talk about the ideology of these nut rolls. ISIS is not merely a terrorist organization. They're an inspiring state. It's rooted in radical ideology that's trying to build a global caliphate through terror and bloodshed. Geneva Abdo and Lua Rizkala of the Stimpser Center wrote, "The narrative ISIS advances as a caliphate state where Muslims can live free from oppression and be governed solely by the rules of Islam, as interpreted by ISIS, of course. The state is ruled by a caliph to whom everyone pledges allegiance in this state, and there's no room for unbelievers." The ideology of ISIS reflects a repudiation of international boundaries and norms. As journalist Anand Gopal said, "I don't think ISIS is necessarily more bloodthirsty than the Assad regime or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. What's different about ISIS is they're very happy to show their atrocities. They post it on Twitter. They put it on YouTube. And it's because they've basically rejected the international order. They're rejecting working with the international order, and they're claiming their own order, an Islamic order harking back to the caliphate days. And because of that, it seems like they're much more bloodthirsty than other groups. ISIS embraces an extreme Salafist interpretation of Islamic governance. Ed Hussein of the Council of Foreign Relations said, "To the violent Salafi, Tawhid, which is the oneness of God, is political as well as creedal. To rule by democracy is to violate God's sovereignty, according to them. Man-made law is the ultimate violation of pure Tawhid. And to oppose the corruption of monotheism, extreme Salafs will walk the path of jihad. Their jihad is not to remove Syrian President Bashar al-Assad or a secular government. It's to create God's government or a caliphate that holds up God's law by applying their form of Sharia." Now, just to stay in context, Islam seems to think they're the only monotheistic religion, which means they believe they're the only religion that believes in one God, and the rest of us believe in multiple gods, and you can't tell them any different. ISIS advances its ideology with the context of a state that performs traditional administrative functions. As Foreign Policy, The Atlantic recently reported, ISIS maintains electricity, water, sewage functions, hospitals, transportation, an army, and schools, among many other public services. It's even developing its own currency. He said ISIS is the most dangerous terrorist group in the world because they combine the fighting capabilities of al-Qaeda with the administrative capabilities of Hezbollah. David Kelcoon, a counterinsurgency expert who worked as a top aide to General David Petraeus, told Foreign Policy it's clear that they have a state-building agenda and an understanding of the importance of effective government. ISIS growth and its ongoing competition with al-Nusra reflects the decentralization and franchisement of al-Qaeda and its ideology. As the New York Times put it in January of 2014, what links these groups, experts say, is no longer a centralized organization, but a loose ideology that any group can appropriate and apply as it sees fit, while it's gaining this mystique of a recognized brand name. Well, in short, al-Qaeda today is less a corporation than a version driving a diverse spread of militant groups. And there is a religious instability. ISIS poses a long-term threat to the stability of the Middle East. As Kimberly Kagan and Frederick Kagan and Jessica Lewis wrote in September of 2014, they said, the permanent destruction of the Iraqi and Syrian states, a principal objective of the Islamic State, would be a grave blow to the international order and American assets. The Islamic State and regional events are bringing enormous pressure on Lebanon and Jordan, which may well collapse under the weight. ISIS control of vast swaths of territory provides it with a base to plan terror attacks. As terrorism expert Stuart Gottlieb wrote, one of the great challenges ISIS poses, it currently controls thousands of square miles of ungoverned territory. It's recruiting highly motivated fighters from all over the world. This influx of fighters, along with the open space needed by ISIS commanders to formally train them, offers the group the ability to creatively think up and effectively carry out major attacks, including against the United States. Jordan fears that ISIS seeks to overthrow the monarchy. In October of 2014, senior Jordan security official told IHS Jane Jordan security services and armed forces were put on the highest state of alert in September in response to the Islamic State's growing capability and the belief the group is a direct security threat to the country. Well, in September 2014, Mahid al-Shariri, the mayor of Ma'an in southern Jordan, told CNN the Salafi jihadi movement has been in Jordan for years, not just in Ma'an, but also in other cities. If this movement in Iraq and Syria declares a war on Jordan, they won't hesitate to carry out operations in Jordan. ISIS attacks on Lebanon have been threatened to drag the country into war, as the Associated Press reported. The Islamic State group threat first came to Lebanon in August in a surprise attack. Islamic State group and al-Nusra Front militants crossed over from Syria and overran the predominantly Sunni Lebanese border town of Arsal, hitting Lebanese army positions and killing nearly 20 soldiers. Cross-border attacks by ISIS have been continuing regularly thereafter. ISIS-linked groups in the Sinai Peninsula have unleashed a campaign of terror as part of an effort to overthrow the regime of Assisi. On October 24, 2014, the terrorist group, which had sworn allegiance to ISIS, killed 26 Egyptian troops with a car bomb, according to Newsweek members at ABM. They claim the ISIS fighters are training and teaching them how to hone their terrorist skills. So is this a global threat? Well, ISIS considers itself the vanguard of terrorist activity worldwide. Matthew Olson, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, said in September of 2014, ISIS views itself as the new leader of the global jihad. It operates the most sophisticated propaganda machine of any extremist group. We've seen ISIS use a range of media to tout its military capabilities. Executions of captured soldiers, consecutive battlefield victories. More recently, the group's supporters have sustained the momentum on social media by encouraging attacks in the U.S. and against U.S. interest in retaliation for airstrikes. ISIS threatens to outpace al-Qaeda as the dominant voice of influence in the global extremist movement. The leader of ISIS has repeatedly threatened the United States. Remember when al-Baghdadi said, "I'll see you in New York"? Reportedly, he told the U.S. Army reservists as a prisoner in Iraq in 2009. Well, in 2012, in an audio speech, he said that U.S. citizens cannot travel to any country without being afraid. In November of 2014, he urged Muslims to attack the agents of the Jews and Crusaders, their slaves, tails, and dogs, and to erupt volcanoes of jihad everywhere. Well, U.S. Army intelligence has warned of possible ISIS attacks on American military personnel. As the Army Threat Integrated Center, that's the ARTIC, said in September of 2014, given the continued rhetoric being issued by ISIS media service and supporters throughout various social media platforms, it's concerned of the possibility of an attack. Ex-Attorney General Eric Holder said in 2014 the possibility of ISIS infiltration into the U.S. was more frightening than anything I've ever seen as Attorney General. Foreign fighters have traveled to Syria to fight for ISIS and may pose a security risk when they return home. A CIA spokesman told CNN in September 2014 more than 1,500 fighters, including 2,000 Westerners from more than 80 countries. Department of Homeland Security said in September of 2014, 100 people from the United States have traveled or attempted to travel to Syria. According to Michael Singh of the Washington Institute for Near East Policies, says the foreign fighters who flock to fight with ISIS or seek safe haven in the territories it controls will one day disperse, perhaps destabilizing other countries in the region. The Western passport holders among them, along with homegrown extremists merely inspired by ISIS, may seek to carry out attacks at home, which are inspired but not necessarily directed by the group. In Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines have all expressed fears of homegrown terrorists inspired by ISIS. As the diplomat reported, authorities in these countries fear homegrown Islamic militants in league with Baghdadi and his Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, will return and plot their own caliphate, not unlike they did when it launched its own terror campaign in league with al-Qaeda more than a decade ago. Well, ISIS is not a unitary organization with a single chain of command. It's an international movement that attracts independent supporters throughout the world. As Jordan's King Abdullah II said in April of 2015, in a way, it's a franchise. The problem is they're international. I don't think the international community realizes that they have to be dealt with internationally. So today we're focusing on ISIS. But at the same time, in 2015, we have to have a holistic approach. ISIS international supporters work to advance the group's cause without necessarily taking direct orders from its leader. James Comley, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, said after the May 3, 2015 shooting attack in Texas, he said, "In a way, the old paradigm between inspired and directed breaks down here. It's not a useful framework," he said. ISIS offers prospective supporters two choices: either join the group in Iraq and Syria or conduct attacks at home. In an audio recording released May of 2015, ISIS leader al-Baghdadi urged Muslims to migrate to the Islamic State or fight in his land wherever he may be. The New York Times reported that ISIS released the recording with translations in English, French, German, Russian, and Turkey, an unusual move suggesting that the group was hoping for maximum exposure, and they got it. ISIS' aggressive and highly sophisticated social media campaign facilitates this group's global reach. Over 90,000 messages a day, said John Carlin, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, in May of 2015. He added, "It's to millions of people across the globe. What they're trying to do is convince young people to go over and ultimately slaughter civilians in vicious wars." And thanks in part to ISIS recruitment efforts, foreign fighters now comprise the majority of the group's forces in Iraq and Syria. According to the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, ISIS now retains 20,000 foreign fighters, including 3,400 Westerners and 180 Americans, out of a total force of some 31,000. ISIS believes its efforts will ultimately lead to the creation of a global caliphate. As they said in March of 2015, we want, Allah willing, Paris before Rome. After that, we'll blacken your life and blow up your White House, Big Ben, and the Eiffel Tower. Allah willing, we want Kabul, Caracas, Riyadh, then Tehran. We want Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Dubai, Amman, and Muslims shall return to the ruling and leadership everywhere. Well, you know, ISIS is also an American franchise. The FBI is investigating suspected ISIS supporters in all 50 states. This isn't a New York phenomenon or a Washington phenomenon. This, according to FBI Director James Connolly, in February of 2015, he said, this is all 50 states, and in ways that are very hard to see. He said the haystack is the entire country, and we're looking for the needles, but increasingly the needles are unavailable to us. ISIS leadership explicitly encourages lone wolf attacks. In congressional testimony in 2015, Michael Stenback, assistant director of the FBI, cited one recent example of a video ISIS via social media that reiterates the group's support of lone offender attacks in Western countries. The video specifically advocates the attacks against soldiers, law enforcement, and intelligence members. ISIS' reliance on social media for the recruitment of America makes potential sympathizers extremely difficult to track. Because of the use of the internet, we could have little or no notice in advance of an independent actor attempting to strike. Homeland Security Secretary Jeb Johnson said in May of 2015, and Nicholas J. Rasmussen, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, said congressional testimony that the homegrown violent extremists cultivated by ISIS on U.S. soil can potentially operate undetected and can plan and execute a simple attack without providing us warning. The recent shooting attack in Texas against the Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest marks the first successful attack in the United States that ISIS central leadership has claimed as its own. As Defense Secretary Ashton Carter put it, it's concerning that there's individuals like this who draw their inspiration from ISIS, and finally, it's yet another reason why the defeat of ISIS is important. It has the larger meaning because of the ability of the movement like this to inspire a certain sort of person. Over the past year, law enforcement officials have arrested multiple ISIS-inspired extremists plotting to attack the U.S. homeland. The FBI has charged, among others, an Ohio man for planning to attack the U.S. Capitol building, 2 Illinois men seeking to attack a U.S. military facility, a Kansas man for attempting to detonate a bomb at a military base in that state, and a New York man for plotting to kill U.S. soldiers who had returned from Iraq, and still another New York man for offering to slay the President of the United States if ISIS ordered it. The Bureau has also said a New York man's hatchet attack last year on a group of 4 NYPD officers in Queens constitutes an act of terror inspired in part by ISIS. Pro-ISIS groups have waged cyber attacks on the United States. In perhaps the most dramatic case in January of 2015, a pro-ISIS group known as the Cyber Caliphate attacked the Twitter and YouTube accounts of U.S. Central Command. In February 2015, the Cyber Caliphate attacked the Twitter accounts of Newsweek and the veterans group Military Spouses of Strength, and also the website of International Business Times. And the breaking news system of Maryland television station said, "We observed all of the movements that you're doing from our devices." Another pro-ISIS group stated in a video released in 2015, "Soon you will see how we control your electronic world." Well, over the past year, law enforcement officials have arrested numerous Americans planning to travel to Syria to join ISIS. To date, the FBI has brought charges against Americans trying to travel to Syria from multiple states, including North Carolina, New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and California, among others. Admiral Mike Rogers, director of the National Security Agency, said in May of 2015 the ideology of ISIS is increasingly resonating with Americans, and they're threatening mass destruction. It said ISIS tried to execute mass terror attacks that would devastate American lives and infrastructure. Ahmad Rashidi, a former prisoner of ISIS who escaped to Turkey, told Meet the Press that ISIS is happy about the U.S. bombing campaign in Iraq and Syria because it makes the group seem as important as al-Qaeda, which ISIS seeks to surpass in brutality. They want to be more better than al-Qaeda, he said. They want to do something more than the World Trade Center. ISIS had threatened to repeat the attacks of September 11th. In an April 2015 video titled "We Will Burn America," that includes footage of the World Trade Center destruction, ISIS threatened to burn the United States again. He said America thinks it's safe because of its geographical location, the video said. Thus, you see it invades the Muslim lands, and it thinks the army of the jihad won't reach into their lands. But the dream of the American to have safety became a mirage. Today, there's no safety for any American on the globe. Former Deputy Director of the Intelligence Agency, has warned that ISIS seeks to commit 9/11-like attacks. If we don't get ISIS under control, said Michael Morrell, who also twice served as the CIA's acting director following the departure of Leon Panetta and David Petraeus, said we're going to see that kind of attack. They've announced their intentions, Morrell said, just like bin Laden did the years prior to 9/11. ISIS has researched the use of weapons of mass destruction against the West. According to the report of Foreign Policy last year, Syrian rebels uncovered a laptop from ISIS that included a document explaining how to develop biological weapons. Now, the advantage of biological weapons is they don't cost a lot of money, while the human casualties can be huge. This, according to the documents. The computer also contained a fatwa from Saudi cleric justifying their use. He said if Muslims cannot defeat the kafir, that's the unbelievers, in a different way, the fatwa said it's permissible to use weapons of mass destruction, even if it kills all of them and wipes their descendants off the face of the earth. Well, and I think the New York Post said it well when they said an ISIS minion on Wednesday posted a warning that the terrorist caliphate has 71 trained soldiers in America spread across 15 states. The group also has ownership of the failed Sunday attack on the Draw Mohammed event in Texas. It went on to say, count us unfazed. Despite wearing bulletproof vests, both got taken out by a traffic cop with a handgun before they could do more than shoot a school security guard in the leg. Some soldiers, huh? It also looks like ISIS did more than vaguely inspire the two. Yes, one attacker, Elton Simpson, had tweeted with ISIS members for months, but he flirted with Islamism long before there was an ISIS, talking of joining another group, Al-Shabaab, years ago. Yes, the threat's real. Lone wolf attacks, ones by radicalized Americans who aren't taking orders from abroad as they plan their evil. It's a genuine threat of law enforcement worry. Such plotters are hard to spot in advance. They can do great harm, but the current ISIS bluster doesn't change anything on that front. Law enforcement faces the same challenge it did in 9/11, once the New York Police Department at least has managed to handle so far successfully. That said, ISIS is no JV team, Mr. President. However limited its reach for now, it certainly aims to infiltrate real trained soldiers into the United States. But the answer there is to make sure ISIS and all its ilk are stamped out wherever they raise their heads. It's time to put more teeth in that degrade and destroy campaign, Mr. President. Well, thank you for joining me for this discussion. You can see news updates at the website at wdeanshook.com, and you can download the mobile app for your iPhone or your Android at Google Play or the App Store. And as usual, when the dust settles and the smoke clears, I'll be back with more truth in the news. I'll see you on our next episode. Thank you.
You can get these full stories and more at wdeanshook.com. That's wdeanshook.com.